So why was there a civil war in the United States? Why did the so-called United States disunite and then a war followed that disunion? Um, Basically, why do we have this class? And Americans and people throughout the world have been discussing that issue since the war itself started. In fact, Americans were discussing a civil war, an internal civil war, before the American Civil War even started. They were prophesying it, they were fearing it, trying to avoid it. And Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, so after he was elected president second time in 1864, he then went and spoke at his second inaugural address, and he said, um, basically, why did we have a war? And he said, all dreaded it, all sought to avert it. Both parties deprecated war. And so he's saying, like, people didn't want this. And then he ends with, and the war came, in a kind of passive, who made the war, what caused the war. In his second inaugural address, he then went on and talked about how slavery, the 1/8 of the population owned by owned by others, was somehow at the root of it. So Americans and people throughout the globe have been discussing this, like what caused the war, for decades, for 150 plus years. The easy answer is slavery. And then other scholars come back to that. So, but wait a second, there was slavery before 1860, 1861. Why those years in particular? And that only answers perhaps why was there secession? Because there's multiple questions here. There's questions within questions. So why secession? Why did states leave the Union? And then we have, why did the United States government under Abraham Lincoln and Congress go to war? And then why did everyday citizens volunteer for that war? And so, because there could have been peaceful secession, right? States could have left, and the government, the United States government, could have thrown up its hands in the air and said, we don't know. So there's questions of why it happened when. So there's issues of time. For a lot of historians after the war, the answer was slavery, slavery expanding. And then in the early 20th century, some scholars started offering a more economic reason for it, that it was a difference of economies, that basically free labor capitalism in the North didn't want to accept traditional slave societies in the South. And so, in fact, the Civil War was a capitalist destruction of a non-capitalist economy. Then, as we move in the 20th century, there were political answers. In the 1950s, during the Cold War and the Red Scare, historians started talking about how this was a, quote, blundering generation who was filled with paranoia, that politicians on both the North and the South were paranoid, lived in fear of what was happening, and they eventually went to war. And it seems pretty clear these historians who were living in an era of political fear and paranoia and fear of nuclear war saw the American Civil War in that light. Then when we get to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, once again, the issue of slavery came up, and the activities of African Americans became central to why there was a war. And some debates then turned around, well, was the issue about issues of slavery, or was it ethnic differences, ethnic tensions, especially in the North, that led to the rise of this new political party, the Republican Party? So there's questions within questions. By the 1970s, 1980s, the main answer for why there was a civil war was the political problem of slavery in the Western territories, that these Western territories would become states. So it wasn't slavery in general, and it wasn't slavery in the United States South, geographically in particular. It was the issue of slavery's expansion into places basically in the middle of the continental United States. So historians still like to debate this topic. They still like to resurrect older answers. They like to parse them, move them around. I find what's most interesting to me at this point is if you look at a global perspective as to why there was an American Civil War, on one hand, we see that the United States really isn't that particular. Most civil societies, lots of civil societies, has had internal conflicts that have turned militant. I mean, in English history, you have the Glorious Revolution. Well, it's called the Revolution because a side won, but it was basically a civil war, and the English had had civil wars before then. Typically, civil societies have multiple civil wars. A second way of thinking of this in kind of global perspective is if you asked Europeans in the mid-19th century why the American system wasn't going to work out, slavery would be part of their answer, but often their answer would be because of democracy. Because the United States being a democratizing republic, that's just not a workable government system. You have to have some form of monarch, some form of ultimate authority, and that in American civil society, while there's a president, while there's Congress, while there's a Supreme Court, no one group is really necessarily above another. And that's true of, in the mid-19th century, of what's the relationship between the federal government and states. It's not the case that it's so clear that the federal government is above the states. It becomes jurisdictional issues. And so the issue of governance and political forms, and that maybe the Civil War as part of a democratizing republic, maybe the result of war was just another example of the democratization, that people would vote with their feet, literally by going to war. And so I vote with my ballot, and then I vote with my feet. And so why was there a Civil War? I remember I was asked during my graduate school comprehensive exams. This is a great question. What 5 people would you kill and when to try to stop the American Civil War? And so that's what we're going to actually do in our discussion board here, is get into how would you have stopped it from happening as a way of thinking about what caused it.